From 1947 to 1991, the world was stood on the edge of oblivion.
Had a war been sparked, unquestionably it would have been the end, not of civilization, but of Earth.
We were gripped by the Cold War, a period when the United States and the Soviet Union armed themselves with enough nuclear missiles to destroy the planet many times over.
Both kept making and updating bombs all day, every day. There were never enough.
In this episode of Conspiracy, we reveal a shocking theory: that the Cold War was down to the lies of a Nazi trying to stay out of jail.
Because the Americans were so ignorant about the Soviet Union and about the Red Army, they were primed to believe the worst.
We ask whether a Soviet submarine tried to start World War III.
You have to realize that this missile was up in a launch position. It was fueled. It was in countdown.
And whether the United States was behind the brutal murder of Italy's most popular prime minister.
It made perfect sense in Brussels and Washington to have this man out of the way. It was a risk not worth taking.
Officially, history tells us the events recounted in Conspiracy may not have happened. But in a world seconds from annihilation, unofficially, they may well have done. For half of the 20th century, the world was on the brink of destruction, as America and the Soviet Union built more and more deadly nuclear weapons. Weapons that could destroy the world in mere minutes.
This is a time when we all thought that the US and the Soviet Union were looking for a way to successfully start a Third World War.
This constant near Armageddon, known as the Cold War, began in 1947 and lasted until just after the fall of the Berlin Wall.
During the Cold War, there were regularly stories in newspapers about nuclear weapons confrontation. School children were taught something called duck and cover.
The paranoia and secrecy of the Cold War was the perfect breeding ground for incredible theories. One of the most shocking is that the entire conflict may have been the invention of just one man, the biggest con man in history, Major General Reinhard Gehlen.
Reinhard Gehlen succeeded in shifting the basis of American understanding of the Soviet Union and in creating that fear of Soviet capabilities. Gehlen shaped the Cold War.
On May the 22nd, 1945, General Reinhard Gehlen, the Nazis' chief of military intelligence for the Eastern Front, turned himself over to the Americans. But it was all part of a plan.
When Gehlen surrenders to the Americans, he doesn't think he's changing sides. He was anti-Soviet before, he's anti-Soviet now. And he's only one of hundreds of thousands of Germans going from loyalty to Hitler to doing what's best for them and changing their loyalties to suit the times.
But Gehlen was no ordinary general. As head of intelligence for the Eastern Front, he'd gathered crucial information about Russia that he knew would prove invaluable once the war was over. So months before his surrender to the Americans in 1945, he began planning to save his own skin.
He begins to prepare for the future. And this is where he's very clever. He thinks to himself, I am going to take our records on the Soviet Union, on the Eastern Front, and we're going to divide them into 8. And I'm going to have them placed all over Germany. And only I'm going to know, with couple of my lieutenants where they are. And then I'm going to see what happens at the end of the war.
Galen correctly predicted that in the aftermath of the war, the two former allies, America and Russia, would turn on each other. But it wasn't just his information he was bargaining with when he surrendered to the Americans. It was also his spy network.
Reinhard Galen offered, first of all, facts, his records. Galen's records were genuinely amazing. Second of all, an organization that could keep those records up to date. And third of all, Galen himself as the man who could pull all this together.
Galen knew exactly what he was doing. The truth was, the Americans and the British didn't have a lot of material on the Soviets. And these people came with information. Now, they weren't coming because they were friends of the British or the Americans. They were coming because they were trying to save their skins.
In the immediate aftermath of the war, Galen should have been handed over to the Soviets. But the security services were so keen to get hold of his intelligence, they did something quite remarkable. Gave him an alias and invited him to the United States to work with the Pentagon. They even allowed Galen to head up a brand new intelligence organization, the Org, based just outside Munich.
There was a deliberate blindness on both sides of this equation. The Americans wanted information, but they didn't really want to know exactly where it came from.
And that blindness extended to the men Galen employed in his new role as head of the Org. Many of them his former Nazi colleagues, including Franz Six, the SS Brigade Führer who liquidated prominent Jews in Russia, and Alois Brunner, thought to be personally responsible for the deaths of over 128,000 Jews.
Key members of Galen's team should have been tried for war crimes. They should have been put in prison. Galen was also directly involved in some of the most horrific crimes of the war. And I'm referring here specifically to the capture and the systematic, deliberate starvation of more than 3 million Soviet prisoners of war.
Historian Timothy Neftali agrees that it's a matter of record that some of the biggest war criminals of World War II simply reinvented themselves with the help and money of their former enemy, the Allies.
All they were doing was trying to save their lives. They were trying to avoid going to jail for being part of, in some cases, the criminal organization, the SS. They were looking for a pension. And Galen set up an excellent retirement system for a group of people who had helped create a monster state.
But Galen's intelligence org, tasked with supplying information about the Russians to the US, was far from a retirement scheme for Nazi war criminals. The real conspiracy was what many believe Reinhard Galen did next. He single-handedly created the threat of the Cold War.
Because the Americans were so ignorant about the Soviet Union and about the Red Army, they were primed to believe the worst.
In August 1945, the first atomic bomb was exploded by the Americans over Hiroshima, instantly killing 80,000 people and hastening the end of World War II. 4 years later, the Soviets exploded their first nuclear bomb, and the Cold War took a much more deadly turn.
Both the United States and Soviet Union tried to build as many nuclear bombs as they possibly could, because you never knew how many you'd need. Neither the US nor the Soviet Union knew how many of their warheads would survive the first strike from the other side. So both the US and Soviet Union kept making and updating bombs all day, every day. There were never enough.
Some believe that much of the information that fueled the nuclear arms race and the Cold War came from one man, the former Nazi spy master, Reinhard Galen. At the end of the war, Galen had stayed out of jail by persuading the US Secret Service that his intelligence on Russia was invaluable. And by 1947, he was running a new spy ring named the Org, this time for the Americans. But investigative journalist Chris Simpson believes the information he provided over the next decade was largely false.
A series of reports that originated with Galen's organization said that the Russians were far ahead in the process of building missiles, of delivering missiles on an intercontinental basis. In the world of 1955, 1954, there was really no way to check.
But by the late 1950s, there was a way to check Galen's information. The USA developed the U-2 spy plane, capable of flying over the Soviet Union at 70,000 feet. And it could take intelligence photos of the supposed missile sites. But instead of seeing the missiles that Galen had suggested the Soviets had, they found next to nothing, proof that Galen's Org was lying. But still, the USA continued to work with Galen and his team.
We knew from U-2 intelligence that the Russians did not, in fact, have these missiles, but nevertheless we ramped up as though they did have these missiles.
So why did the US continue to behave as if Galen's intelligence was accurate when they had clear evidence it wasn't? The reason perhaps relates to the arrival of a new US president. In 1960, one of President Kennedy's key election policies had been to catch up with Soviet missile production and increase military budgets. The American public had been told that Russian capability far outstripped that of the USA. So no one in the government wanted to hear that the Soviets did not in fact possess dozens of missiles.
Galen played a crucial role in the missile gap because he was the source of the information that was used to justify the budgets, that was used to justify this fear cycle that creates these escalations.
The claim is that by 1962, Galen's reports and the American military's desire for ever more weapons had resulted in the USA having 203 nuclear missiles capable of hitting the Soviet Union. And in October of that year, it looked like they were finally going to use them.
It shall be the policy of this nation to regard any nuclear missile launched from Cuba against any nation in the Western Hemisphere as an attack by the Soviet Union on the United States.
If we were crazy enough to fight World War III, someone had to be crazy enough to start it.
History tells us that the button was almost pressed when the Soviet Union placed nuclear missiles on the island of Cuba, just over 100 miles from Florida. But, according to some, the world actually came far closer to nuclear war in 1967, when a Soviet Gulf-class submarine K-129 left its northern port to cruise the Pacific.
The Soviets called these patrols war patrols. To them, we were at a state of war, and they took this very, very seriously.
Like submarines on both sides, K-129's role was to remain underwater for months, waiting for orders should the Cold War finally escalate. But K-129's mission was never completed as planned.
She was supposed to send a radio message, just a burst message of a second or two, every couple of days. She sent the first one, but never sent another one. As far as the Soviets were concerned, she was never heard from again.
As soon as the Soviets realized they'd lost a sub, they sent a massive fleet to search the area where she should have been patrolling. But they found nothing. But someone else did know where she was. Hundreds of miles to the south of the Soviet search area, close to Hawaii, an American system of special underwater microphones had picked up the telltale signs of a submarine exploding.
The United States realized there was a problem with a Soviet submarine when the Air Force seafloor system, hydrophones on the ocean floor, heard the sounds of the K-129 igniting, which gave us the timing and the approximate location.
Within months, the USS Halibut, a special reconnaissance submarine, had located the wreck of the Russian sub. The photos she took proved that the K-129's missiles had ignited, and that's what had caused her to sink.
The photos reveal that 2 of the missiles were totally destroyed. Obviously, their engines had ignited, but they were locked in their launch chambers, in their launch tubes, and they just burned out into the submarine, and the missiles themselves were just destroyed and gone. There was virtually nothing left of that section of the submarine. But that 3rd missile still was intact.
But for Kenneth Sewell, the big question was not whether the Russian sub had exploded, but what was she doing so close to Hawaii? Sewell's theory is that K-129 was not on a so-called war patrol when she sank, but that she was actively engaged in launching one of her missiles against the USA.
You have to realize that this missile was up in a launch position. It was fueled. It was in countdown. I mean, we were literally minutes, maybe seconds away from this bird taken to the air. It would have started World War III. It would have changed the balance of power in the Cold War, ultimately leading to the demise of the United States, Great Britain, Canada, Australia.
His theory is based not just on the location of K-129 when she exploded, or the fact that one missile was in the launch position, but on a discrepancy in her crew list.
The normal crew complement for a Gulf-class submarine is around 83 to 85 people. We found out later, officially they released, that there was 98 people on board. There is no scenario where there would be an extra 12 or 15 people on board for any reason. We suspect that the men who joined the K-129 right before they sailed was a KGB commando team. These were the highly trained, hand-picked for KGB operations. Very ruthless killers. There's no doubt in my mind that this commando team that boarded K-129 was there to take control of that submarine, to travel to a specific spot in the ocean, launch a missile at Pearl Harbor, and start World War III.
Sewell's belief is that K-129 was hijacked by KGB chairman Yuri Andropov as part of a mission not sanctioned by his bosses in the Kremlin. Andropov was convinced that World War III was inevitable, and that if it was between China and the USA, then Russia, watching from the sidelines, could emerge victorious.
They tried to start a war between us and China. They did that to weaken the United States, to strengthen the Soviet Union. Get your 2 enemies to fight, and you pick up the pieces.
Sewell's theory is that the KGB team was trying to trick the US into believing it was under attack from China, not Russia. Key to his theory is that K-129 was wrecked 400 miles from Pearl Harbor, which is exactly the range of the missiles Chinese submarines carried at the time.
That location where the K-129 went down was exactly where a Chinese submarine would have launched to attack Pearl Harbor. The missiles they carried had a range of 400 nautical miles. And if it had been a Soviet submarine actually making an attack sanctioned by the Soviet government, it would most definitely have launched from 800 miles. There was no doubt it would have been blamed on the Chinese. There's no doubt that American missiles would have been in the air heading for China.
If Kenneth Sewell is right, and K-129 had been hijacked by Soviet hardliners, what saved the world from Armageddon?
I believe that the captain realized that this was not an authorized act by the Soviet government, that it was a rogue element in the KGB, and I believe the captain gave them the wrong code. When you had attempted launch with the wrong code, it would detonate the warhead, which would cause the missile to explode, which sank the submarine. We owe him a really big debt of gratitude. He's one of these unsung heroes of history that will never really get credit.
Whatever caused the sinking of the K-129, 7 years after she'd sunk, the Americans attempted to salvage her. And in one of the most audacious missions of the Cold War, they contracted the maverick billionaire Howard Hughes to provide the cover story.
The cover story for the recovery of the K-129, in my opinion, was just unbelievable. that the government could ask Howard Hughes, a very eccentric billionaire, to sponsor a secret project that was totally out of James Bond.
Using Howard Hughes as a front, the CIA built this ship, the Hughes Glomar Explorer, which appeared to be a deep-sea drill ship, but was in fact a secret salvage vessel.
CIA used oil field drilling technology to put down 16,000 feet of steel pipe with a giant claw on the end to pick up the submarine.
According to Kenneth Sewell, the CIA wanted to bring the sub to the surface to prove it was engaged in an attack on the USA.
There was nothing that we needed from that submarine in 1975 except to bring it back and to use it to blackmail the Russians.
He claims that by putting the submarine on display, the rest of the world would find out what the Russians had planned. Unfortunately, things didn't go to plan, and the submarine never made it to the surface.
As the claw was lifting it, for a number of technical reasons, the submarine broke. The main part containing the missile with the nuclear warhead broke off, fell back to the ocean floor, and we were able to pull in only the forward 38 feet of the submarine.
But had the rest of the submarine made it to the surface, Norman Polmar is certain that the mystery of the K-129 sinking would have proved to have been no more than a tragic accident. Based on seabed photos, he's sure he knows what happened.
We know Russian missile submarines would check, test their fire control missile launch system. Something went wrong on the K-129. Probably a short circuit, a mechanical difficulty of some sort, ignited one of the missiles in the tube. The top of the tube, the cap, was closed. So the exhaust from this very powerful liquid-fueled rocket tore into the submarine, instantly killing all 98 people. At the same time, the ignition of the first missile started to tear apart that part of the submarine. Some number of seconds later, the second missile ignited. By this time, the submarine was torn open and sinking. The third missile did not ignite. And that's what led the United States to want to salvage the submarine, was to get the guidance system and the warhead of that third nuclear missile.
But Kenneth Sewell remains convinced that the 8th of March 1968 was the day the world almost ended.
We really dodged a bullet on this one. This was the perfect crime. I mean, had they gotten away with it, they would have won the Cold War.
For over 40 years, the USA, the UK, and Western Europe were convinced the Soviet Union was hell-bent on one thing: expanding west to take over the whole of Europe.
The United States and its allies were genuinely concerned that if guard were let down for just a moment, the Soviet Union would grab hold of all of Western Europe and turn it into a gray, faceless, communist world.
To make sure this didn't happen, the USA adopted a policy they called containment, and in 1949 they formed NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, a military alliance of Western countries poised to destroy any threat of Soviet invasion. But while defense against the Russians was the main objective, many believe a more sinister plot was afoot: to wipe out anyone seen as pro-communist, even a prime minister.
From the time of the Bolshevik Revolution back in 1917, people in the West were really worried that there were Reds under the beds, that communists pretending to be ordinary, decent human beings were going to come out and facilitate a Soviet takeover of the world.
At the start of the Cold War in 1947, one Western country in particular popped up on the anti-communist radar: Italy. Once a fascist country, much of its population were now flirting with communism.
Italy comes out of the Second World War deeply ashamed of what its army did during World War II, deeply ashamed of its attachment to Mussolini and to fascism. In the late 40s, the US is desperately afraid that it's going to lose Italy to the Eastern Bloc. And so the CIA invests a great deal in rigging the Italian elections.
But many believe that the CIA continued to meddle in Italian elections for decades, making sure Italy was always governed by a right-of-center government. But some historians claim that wasn't the end of the Americans' interference in Italian politics. They claim that after 3 decades of funding anti-communist parties in Italy, the US, along with NATO, went far further, brutally murdering Italy's most popular prime minister, Aldo Moro.
It made perfect sense in Brussels and Washington to have this man out of the way. It was a risk not worth taking.
By the 1970s, Italy had become home to some of the largest US military bases in Europe.
The hulls of many a warship owing allegiance to NATO are washed here. There is a huge nuclear base hinging on Vicenza, thousands of nuclear missiles, the largest stock of such, anywhere in Europe.
But in 1976, after almost 40 years of a right-of-center government, the communists began to gain support again, winning 34% of the vote. The accusation is that alarm bells rang in America when former Prime Minister Aldo Moro proposed a coalition government formed between his right-wing Christian Democrats and the communists.
The real fear was that it would generate a popular mood against Italy's presence in NATO and in the westernized military bloc. This was the obsession which overtook Western capitals, that if you had a communist presence in government, it would in fact turn Italy into a province of the Kremlin.
In American eyes, communists at the heart of a Western government would be opening the door to the Soviet Union. Former MEP and author Richard Cottrell believes the US and NATO weren't going to let that happen.
The objective was to remove communism as a threat in an extremely important European country with a large number of strategic interests, which were too risky and too important to be left to even the slightest risk of the Soviet Union getting their hands on the tin opener.
The ideal solution, some believe, to preventing the communist coalition in Italy was to remove its key supporter from the equation, former Prime Minister Aldo Moro. And on March the 6th, 1978, that's exactly what happened. Aldo Moro was abducted en route to Parliament for a key debate on his new coalition government and then brutally murdered 55 days later.
This is exactly the corner where Moro was attacked. He was supposed to go to the Parliament. It was a very important day for Italian politics. It was the first time that the Christian Democrats and the Communist Party, through the mediation of Aldo Moro, found a coalition together.
The highly organized attack was over in minutes, and in the aftermath, a left-wing militant organization known as the Red Brigades claimed responsibility.
The Red Brigades were a revolutionary communist organization. They'd been founded in 1969. They had been involved in an escalating series of violent acts. They had kidnapped a judge in Genoa, but they had released him in return for a deal with the state.
The Red Brigade's attacks may have been increasing in violence, but the highly organized kidnap of Aldo Moro took their operations to a new level. But author Richard Cottrell believes the evidence doesn't stack up, and that the Red Brigade's claim to be behind the attack was a smokescreen for something far more sinister.
Why they would want to assassinate the man whose side they were on, who was the hero of the workers, who understood what the Red Brigades were doing. No one believed it at the time, and no one believes it now. At this stage, it was known as the second era of the Red Brigades. In other words, all the original founders were either dead or banged up in the cooler.
Cottrell believes the sheer sophistication of the abduction and level of information the kidnappers had access to is highly suspicious.
The snatch had the mark of a precision military operation. It requires an enormous degree of intelligence behind it in order to plot and carry out this act.
Andrea Purgatori was one of the first journalists at the scene and has a keen interest in the story. He too suspects the operation was beyond the capacity of the Red Brigades.
For me, it was quite shocking the fact that even if Aldo Moro had 5 people of escort, he could have been kidnapped so easily.
The terrorists had done their homework. Knowing the route Moro would take that day, they forced his car to stop by blocking the road as he approached.
When they stopped, suddenly 4 terrorists came from that side, shooting immediately against the escort of Moro. And in a few seconds, everything was finished. The 5 people of the escort were killed, Moro was kidnapped, and that was it.
It wasn't just the operation itself, it was the pre-planning and careful removal of witnesses that many believe is suspect.
Usually, every day in the morning, just at the corner here, there was a van of a florist. The terrorists didn't want this van because it was a problem for the operation. So the night before, they went to the house of the florist and they slashed the wheels of the van. So the florist couldn't come.
But if the kidnapping of Aldo Moro wasn't the work of a left-wing terrorist organization, who was responsible? Richard Cottrell believes the real culprits were a NATO-backed covert operations group called Gladio.
Gladio, the secret army that hides, in the woods, waiting for the Russians to come, buried treasure of weapons all over the place.
Gladio was so secret that their existence was only revealed as a result of a judicial inquiry in 1990. But Cottrell has no doubt the shadowy group was behind the abduction. He claims bullet cases left at the scene of the abduction linked them to the crime.
The material which was found in the street was the same as a cache of weapons which were found in the basement of the Health Ministry in the center of Roma, which later turned out to be the Gladio arms dump.
But if it was Gladio and not the Red Brigades behind the attack, why would the left-wing terrorists own up to it? Cottrell believes the key is the leader of the Red Brigades at the time, a man called Mario Moretti, who he thinks had strong links to the Italian Secret Service and even lived in a building owned by them.
This is almost like a palazzo, if you like, a rather sort of pleasant, upmarket residential block. It also happens to be owned by Sismi, the kind of MI5 of Italy, and they own the place. Well, there is now coming an amazing coincidence. Who lived there? Mario Moretti, the second stage commander of the Red Brigades, lives in this same apartment.
2 days after Moro was kidnapped, police came here for the first time. They were searching all the apartments. They knocked at apartment number 11, where Mario Moretti, the chief of the Roman column of the Red Brigades, was hiding. Nobody answered, and they left.
The theory is that Mario Moretti was a Secret Service plant within the Red Brigades, and that he, with the help of Gladio, planned and executed the kidnapping of Aldo Moro. And it was all sanctioned at the highest level. Moro, once snatched, could never be released.
Of course, nobody officially said it's better that Moro dies. But Moro realizes that he has only one destiny, and the destiny is, I have to die.
The last letter Moro wrote from where he was being held is one of despair. This man, who served as Italy's prime minister for 6 years, expressed his disgust at the Italian state and his own party, who he felt had betrayed him.
I request that at my funeral there be no one present representing the Italian state and no one from the political parties. I ask to be accompanied by those, therefore, that are worthy of accompanying me with their prayers and with their love. Aldo Moro.
On the morning of the 9th of May 1978, 55 days after he was kidnapped, Aldo Moro was shot at point-blank range. His body was later found dumped in the back of a car in the heart of Rome. If the conspiracies are right, Gladio's bullets did their job for their NATO and CIA paymasters. The Communist Party never entered the Italian government during the Cold War. "11 years after Aldo Moro was murdered, the Berlin Wall, the symbol of the Iron Curtain, came down. By 1991, the Cold War was officially over. But unofficially, no one was quite sure.
Nobody knew whether the Cold War had paused or whether it was really over.
Officially, the Cold War ended soon after the Berlin Wall came down, heralding a new era of world peace.
We have agreed to dramatically reduce our total strategic nuclear weapons. Certainly, I agree with what President Yeltsin said, that there is no animosity. The Cold War days are over.
But unofficially, the distrust between the East and West didn't just stop overnight. Western intelligence agencies, including Britain's MI6, were still very much open for business. Suddenly, they found the keys to many Russian secrets could be easily purchased from corrupt officials at a knockdown price.
In the early 1990s, if you wanted to find out about Russian technology, you could walk up to a Russian factory, take out a pile of American $100 bills, plunk it down, and people would show you anything that you wanted.
Western intelligence agencies may have been able to buy Soviet military intelligence from corrupt officials, but getting it out of Russia was still very hard. Many believe that the main route Western intelligence agencies used to get their military technology out of the former Soviet Union was the so-called Baltic Drain Pipe, a smuggling route through the newly independent Baltic state of Estonia across the sea to Sweden.
Estonia had become the battleground of the ongoing Cold War. And one of the reasons is geography. Estonia was a pipeline for many smuggling operations. People, drugs, financial information, all other secrets. It was in many ways smuggling central.
In the early 1990s, newly independent Estonia was still home to dozens of corrupt Soviet troops who lined their pockets by helping Western intelligence services smuggle military technology out of Russia. They used a local ferry, the MV Estonia, which sped the secrets over the sea to Sweden and onwards. It was something the Kremlin could not tolerate.
These spying services used public transport with hundreds of people on board as cover for their smuggling operation, thinking that anything they put on that ship was safe, that there was no way the Russians would try and interfere with that journey because there were hundreds of innocent people on board. The passengers who travelled on the ferry Estonia were human shields.
Davis believes that Western intelligence agencies vastly underestimated the ruthlessness of their Russian counterparts, and that on September the 28th, 1994, the Russians acted to stop their secrets making it to the West. The Estonia had left Tallinn at 7:15 p.m., but at around 1 a.m., when most of the passengers were below decks asleep, a bang was heard, and the ship suddenly lurched to one side.
It was like something out of a film set. I was in this sort of human soup of screaming people.
the entire ship went down in about 45 minutes, killing 852 people. Brit Paul Barney was one of the few to have survived.
Imagine the frustration and anger, being there in the dark at 1 o'clock in the morning, absolutely no idea how far I was from land, no life belt, no life jacket.
The official report into the sinking blamed a combination of human error, bad weather and design faults, leading to the ferry's bow doors failing and the ship flooding. But Stephen Davis believes the real reason behind the Estonia's sinking was that the Kremlin planted a bomb that blew off the bow doors. So what was worth murdering over 800 innocent civilians for?
My MI6 source says that on board the Estonia that night were electronic chips which contained crucial information as to the accuracy and range of Russian missiles. I don't believe that Russian intelligence intended to sink the ferry Estonia. What I believe is that they intended to place some kind of explosive device which would disable the ferry and which would force it to turn back. Some warning to the West, a warning to Swedish intelligence, a warning to MI6 that we know about your smuggling operation and we want you to stop. The warning went catastrophically wrong and cost 852 people their lives.
Worse, in the aftermath of the sinking, Davis believes that the Western intelligence agencies actually colluded with the Russians to stop the truth getting out by deliberately burying the evidence.
In the aftermath of the disaster, the Swedish government promised that no expense would be spared to bring the Estonia to the surface to find out what really happened. In engineering terms, this was very doable. Instead of doing that, instead of living up to their promise, they proceeded to bury it, literally and metaphorically.
The theory is that Western intelligence wanted to make sure no one would ever know they'd been using the Estonia to smuggle military secrets. So rather than salvage the ship, the Swedish authorities tried to encase it in a concrete tomb. The only official examination of the wreck was by an American diving company contracted by the Swedish government shortly before the ship was entombed. But according to Davis, the key evidence from the dive was suppressed.
There was an official dive team that went down and they filmed lots of video footage. There appears to be some missing video in what was given to the Swedish government. And not by coincidence, the missing video is the crucial part that would have showed, I think, what happened.
Following the official dive by the Americans, Sweden, Russia and the other Baltic states signed an international treaty banning any further dives on the wreck. But there was a final signatory to the treaty which survivor Paul Barney believes is highly suspicious.
No one has really successfully explained to me why the UK has actually signed this agreement. What's it got to do with the UK? You know, there's some very strange, unexplained questions around the whole sinking, and I think that's one of the most pertinent ones, really.
But one illegal dive was carried out on the Estonia by a private dive team.
They were able to obtain pieces of metal from near the bow doors, which were subsequently analysed in a German laboratory and clearly showed traces of explosives.
If the bow doors really were blown off the Estonia by Russian agents, then it would be the last great crime of the Cold War. But until the Estonia is salvaged, it will remain just a theory. But military historian Lynette Nussbacher is convinced that the theory is wrong.
It's easy for us to try to assign meaning to that loss of life by attaching it to the great story of Cold War covert violence. And the evidence is that, like other ferry disasters of that period, it was just a simple, tragic error.
Whatever lies beneath the waters of the Baltic Sea, the Cold War as we knew it for 40 years is now history. But a history filled with some of the greatest stories ever told. Stories driven by the secrecy and paranoia of the Cold War.
Victim conspiracy continues next Friday with the Lord Lucan dossier. The lines between good and nasty are blurred beyond recognition as stunning drama Sons of Anarchy returns for its 6th season. See that premiere next over on Spike. Here, though, someone's time is up.